The Industrial Revolution occurred from the 1750s to the 1900s. The Industrial Revolution is where non renewable fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas replace renewable energy sources like wind, water, and wood. During this period, the population went up. The Industrial Revolution had an impact on the environment. There was now new sources of energy, and the rate of technological innovations went up. During this time, there was also a term known as culture of innovation, which was the widespread and almost obsessive belief that things could be endlessly improved. One technological breakthrough was iron and steel production. The second industrial revolution focused on chemicals, electricity, machinery, telegraph and telephone, and printing, and much more. The industrial revolution became global in the 20th century. The Industrial Revolution hit Britain because it was the most highly commercialized of Europe's larger countries. Growing populations meant more industrial workers. British's policy of religious toleration welcomed people with technical skills. The scientific revolution in Great Britain was much more concerned with observation, experiment, precise measurement, and mechanical devices. The impact of the Industrial Revolution on British society was full of social conflict, insecurity, and false starts, but also new opportunities and eventually a higher standard of living and greater participation in public life. The class that suffered the most and benefited the least was the middle class from the epidemic transformations of the Industrial Revolution. Europe's Industrial Revolution prompted a massive migration process. People were pushed away by poverty and a growing rapid in population. Industrializations had similar outcomes. New technologies, urbanization, and class structures changed.
From Britain, the United States and Russia had similar outcomes, such as new technologies, sources of energies that spawned in production and urbanization, class structures had changed, working classes had changed, which caused unions and socialist movements, which created social conflict. Yet they had some differences. While the US had major global power, Russia had revolutionary disastrous change. American industrialization broke out after the Civil War in the 1860s. They had the most powerful industrialization in 1914 due to their huge size, natural resources, domestic markets, and political stability. At the time, they produced 36% of the world's manufactured goods. America had begun to gap in their social classes. Some saw the unfairness as a betrayal, as others saw it as a survival for the fittest. The outbreaks of union strikes and protests led to conflict between the diversity of Catholics and Protestants, whites versus blacks, English, Irish, Germans, slaves, Jews, and Italians. So then it became difficult to maintain oriented political parties. The economic growth impacted general life. Land was cheaper and homes were more available. Political changes to the abuses of the capital of industrialization rose. Some outbreaks, like the progressives, were far more elaborate with their work. They pushed for wages and hours, legislation, better sanitation, and better economy. Socialism was seen as an un American since they were liberal and individual. On the other hand, Russia wanted sole output of absolute monarchy. They exercised greater control. In the beginning of the 20th century, Russia had no parliament, legal parties, no nationwide elections. In other words, they had no politics. At the top of their social class were great landowners and leading government officials such as nobles. On the bottom were peasants. During the 1860s, Russia began their industrialization. During the 1890s, the revolution grew very rapidly, primarily because of the railroads, heavy industry, steel production, coal, textiles, and oil. An improvement on the social classes was made. The middle class incorporated businessmen, professionals, and educated people. Although they were independent, they wanted jobs and they depended on the state for that. They sought to have a better way of life. 5% of the Russians were factory workers, but they suddenly broke out due to harsh conditions and no legal outlets. By 1897, over 70% of migrants were from New York or Berlin, living in filthy and suffocating conditions. Marxism, socialism, Russians hoped for a better future. In 1898, they created an illegal Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which gave workers education, unions started organizing, and revolutionary actions. In 1905, after losing a battle with Japan, Russia blew up in new restorings, such as workers having created their own representative councils, which are Soviets, peasant uprisings, student demonstrations, non Russian revolts, and communities of military. In 1905, the revolution suppressed. Tsar was forced to make substantial reforms, which was to bring social stability to Russia. They had built a constitution, they had gained legal trade unions, political parties, elections, and universal education. Russians had limited voices, no matter what their social class was, so the revolution was inevitable. They had to deal with what disasters came and what benefits came from it. Industrialization was accompanied with violent social revolutions, which were protests, unions, and revolts. The Industrial Revolution in Latin America during the 19th century lasted longer and was more destructive than in North America. Latin America had decimated populations, diminished herds of livestock, flooded or closed silver mines, abandoned farms. They shrunk their international trade and investment capital and emptied national treasures. Four major administrative units of Spanish America dissolved into 18 separate countries and regional revolts. Conservatives favored central authority. Their opponents were liberals who attacked the church in the name of Enlightenment values. They sought at least modest social reforms and preferred federalism. Latin America sought to attract more Europeans. Latin America wanted to increase their white population, and they did that by deliberately recruiting impoverished Europeans with the promise of a new and prosperous life in the New World. Lower classes lived in rural areas where they suffered the most and benefited the least from their export boom. To governments interested in stability and progress, unions and strikes were highly proactive and threatening and acted harshly to crush and suppress them. The scientific revolution and industrial revolution both changed the world. One was about the process of discovering, learning, and evaluating the natural world. The other was about applying that understanding to practical ends. In both cases, knowledge spread and improvements were made across cultures and across time. Even though patents protected individual inventions, one scientist or inventor could build on the ideas of colleagues who were tackling the same issue. Some of the inventions made during the Industrial Revolution were the telegraph, the telephone, the light bulb, the internal combustion engine, and the radio. The telegraph was invented in 1837 by Samuel Morse, which allowed people to communicate across great distances within seconds. The telephone was invented in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell. The light bulb was invented in 1879 by Thomas Edison. The internal combustion engine was invented in 1885, and the radio was invented in 1890. At the same time, there were huge advances in medicine and science. Some vaccinations were developed, and x rays came onto the scene.